Welcome to In the World of Winooski. I'm Mayor Christine Lott, and today we are focused on housing supports and resources available in Winooski. Joining me today are our Housing Initiative Director, Jasmine Hurley, and Sean Gilpin, who is the State Housing Division Director and Chair of the Winooski Housing Commission as a resident of the city. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
I'm excited to dig into housing. It's been a high priority in the community for the city and obviously many others and the state. So just for some table setting, we have as a city set a priority on trying to fill gaps in housing that's affordable and larger housing, 3-bedroom plus for larger families that we have living in the city and are welcoming here, as well as affordable ownership opportunities. So those are kind of the priorities we're working under. And there are some other efforts that have been going on. And our Housing Commission has been working heavily in these areas for some time. So I want to first share that the Housing Commission, which you chair and Jasmine, you support, is like a policy advisory body to the City Council for folks who don't know. So we bring in other voices from the community to help with that work. And I will ask you, Sean, first, if you want to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your experience with our Housing Commission.
Sure. So my name is Sean Gilpin, and I am a relatively new Winooski resident. I've been here for a little over 2 years and excited to be part of this community. I came from the old north end of Burlington. I've been there for a long time, but have been excited to be part of the Housing Commission, and as well as especially bringing my expertise from my work as the Housing Division Director at the Department of Housing and Community Development from the state. So I'm excited to be part of that process. Yeah.
Awesome. And Jasmine, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Sure. My name is Jasmine. I am the Housing Initiative Director for the City of Winooski.
So our Housing Commission has previously worked on several efforts, Housing Trust Fund, some, what's the word I want? Incentives to include in our land use regulations, short-term rental regulations, and more recently has been focused on working with our Planning Commission on inclusionary zoning and replacement ordinance. Do you want to tell us a little bit about those efforts?
Sure, absolutely. So, so obviously exciting things going on in Winooski. We're in a really interesting spot, frankly, not just in Winooski, but Chittenden County and in the state, where I'd say that housing has actually become a policy focus, where I think in my experience, over 10 years of experience in this realm, it really hasn't been quite as high a priority, I think, in many people's minds, and especially post pandemic, if you can call it post, but post the height of the COVID pandemic, I think people have really started to understand that housing is healthcare. You can't have good healthcare without, a good place to live. It affects transportation. It affects your access to recreation, to jobs, to all sorts of things. So, very excited to be involved in the Housing Commission, which in Winooski is involved a lot with, I would say, from my perspective, really working on the policies that we have at our disposal as a relatively small but pretty dense and important community in a bigger realm. We often are in the shadow of Burlington a little bit in what we're able to do, but being really concerted about the area that we have and what we can do to address the needs of housing there. So Housing Trust Fund, really incredible and actually cutting edge. It started before I showed up in Winooski, the Housing Trust Fund, to help folks to have a municipal arm in helping with the development of sort of capital A affordable housing. I always make that distinction because all housing is affordable to somebody. It's just a matter of how much income you make. So we often talk about affordable housing as subsidized housing. Doesn't necessarily need to be that way. If we work the markets well and we have good municipal investment, I think that we can actually have affordable housing for people that don't necessarily need a subsidy but need a place to live that their incomes can actually purchase.
Yeah.
So that's a really interesting program. Inclusionary zoning and replacement, were those the other two that you brought up?
Those are the two kind of efforts in progress right now that we're working on.
Yeah, inclusionary zoning is a fascinating concept, and I'd like to think of it as the idea that any one municipality has put a lot of energy into creating that community. A lot of investment goes into that, roads, recreational opportunities, investments into educations, jobs, and the like. That all raises the price and the value of properties in the area. And so without any sort of, you have government intervention to do all of those things to create a valuable community that we all want to live in. And without any intervention on the other side, there is an opportunity, or perhaps a missed opportunity, for allowing developers to come in who, every developer is, needs to make a profit off of their buildings. And of course we want to have that economic development, and we want to make sure that there's a market force happening with our housing development. However, without some sort of policy, it can often end up treating only the high end, if you will, of the market without any sort of middle ground. And so inclusionary zoning is basically the idea of the city has put a lot of energy into creating this really valuable place to develop. And in return, we'd like to make sure that a developer who has a successful development makes sure that they have accounted for and actually produce a product for people who are on a lower income scale than the highest bidder for that housing. And so basically making sure that when a developer wants to come in and into a lovely plot in Winooski and build a great building that's going to house a lot of our new residents, we want to make sure that some of those residents are also folks who are coming up in the world, whether it's just somebody out of school, moving into the area, all those sorts of things, and not necessarily an established person, but somebody who wants to create roots in this place. So the idea is that for a certain number of units that are at sort of the market rate, whatever the market will bear, the developers, the property owners, also have to make sure that they're creating some units that are available and affordable to people who might not be at the cutting edge of the income spectrum that the marketer is shooting for.
I think you made a great point about how there is government intervention in creating a community that we value. We're working towards a community vision for Winooski, and that does, as we make those improvements, it does increase values. And so trying to balance that as growth happens is tricky. And trying to make sure that we do have housing for people across the income spectrum within the city.
Sure.
Could I pivot to Jasmine to speak a little more in depth about the Housing Trust Fund programs that are available?
Sure, I'd love to. So the Housing Trust Fund was designed and kind of created by the Housing Commission, I believe starting in 2019. Things got put on a little bit of hold, as everything did during the pandemic. But shortly after, 3 programs were rolled out. We now have 4, we've added another. But those 4 programs target kind of 3 different buckets of things. The first is for income assistance or funding for first-time homebuyers that are low to moderate income. The second bucket is for property owners for both public buildings and private buildings. So that means buildings that are rented to the public, like your average apartment building, or a private building, which would be like, your single family home that you live in. That's kind of the middle group, and those home improvements range. They include ADA modifications, energy efficiency upgrades, and then code-related repairs. And then the third group is the construction and rehabilitation program. We call that the core program, and that aims to target affordable unit development and rehabilitation. So that's a loan program. The home improvement is called HIP for short, and those are loans, and we just rolled out some grant opportunity as well for homeowners to undergo those repairs I mentioned. And then for the first-time home buyers, we have two programs. So we have the DPA program, which is down payment assistance. That is kind of a traditional program that a lot of lenders offer to lower income first-time home buyers. But our program offers up to $5,000 towards the down payment for a prospective buyer. And then our other program, which is actually our newest program, is the interest rate buy-down program, the IRB. They all have to have abbreviations for whatever reason. And that program was created last year, kind of during all these conversations of really high interest rates and the impact that that was having on lower income buyers who had never bought before. So that program specifically also offers up to $5,000 to buy down the interest rate of a first-time home buyer's mortgage. So you compare that program with the DPA, and someone could get up to $10,000 if they are a first-time home buyer and they're income eligible. So those are the four programs that kind of try to target those three different groups, looking at housing quality, housing construction, and supporting first-time homeownership, because in Winooski, we do have very low rate of homeownership. We're at about 60% renters, which is much higher than many of the other communities in the county. And so this is just one of the, the tools that we are attempting to help bolster people into homeownership. Of course, that's a tall task these days. But the Housing Commission has done a lot of work on the Housing Trust Fund programming and kind of continues to modify it based off of emerging market trends, because we all know that the housing landscape changes quickly.
Yeah, so those are actual financial programs that can help support ownership opportunity. One of the goals, creation of more affordable housing and keeping housing quality intact for folks. And then the other work around inclusionary zoning is more about trying to shape what gets built and make sure that as we add more housing to the city, that there are opportunities across the spectrum. And then replacement ordinance, do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Of course. As the name implies, this is actually one of the few policies I feel like is pretty easy to understand based on just the title alone. Replacement ordinance being the idea that if one is interested in demolishing or removing a structure from our city that has residential uses, that they ought to at least replace the number of units that are there while they're building something new. So I think it's as simple as that
So
we don't want to lose housing.
Yeah.
Which used to be more of a concern than it is now, because there used to be concerns of erosion of residential housing into commercial development, but given our current housing crisis and all of the incentivizing and funding that's going into the development of new housing, the likelihood of that is low, but it's still a valuable tool for a municipality to use.
Yeah, and I think actually, if I may, that's a great point, that the incentivizing is actually having an effect, so that we're not seeing a whole lot of commercial, conversions of residential into commercial, but the other way around, and making sure that that the market's actually working in a way that makes sense for what the community really needs, which right now is obviously a lot more housing development.
And these are programs that work within the city's locus of control over land use regulation. We have sort of limited levers of what we can do to influence the overall housing market. Another opportunity we saw and addressed in the last year with the help of the Housing Commission was putting some regulations in place on short-term rentals, as there was concern about the increase in those taking away from the long-term housing stock. Jasmine, can you tell us a little bit about short-term rental regulations here in Winooski?
Sure. So I would say, I guess it's been over a year now, because it's almost past a year. So probably 2 years ago now, City Council recognized that there was some community concern about the conversion of long-term rental housing into short-term rental housing. And that was brought up to City Council. They asked the Housing Commission and city staff to explore kind of our trends of short-term rentals in the city, and if we thought that it made sense for the city to take some action. The Housing Commission worked on that for about a year and analyzed a lot of data and discussed a lot of different policy options, as a lot of municipalities around the nation have, actually around the world now, have taken a lot of different approaches to this matter. And being that we are such a small municipality with very limited funding and staffing, we had to make sure that the policy solution that we chose fit Winooski, rather than choosing one from another larger municipality, for example. So that was brought to council in February of this year, so it'll be a year ago in February, and that was passed. And the policy that we ended up going with was essentially instituting a short-term rental license and registration program. So every short-term rental owner in the city has to come to City Hall or go online and submit an application for their short-term rental, each unit of short-term rental. Along with that, they disclose some information about the property. We make sure that they are up to date on all of their inspections for their building to make sure that their housing quality is high and there's no safety concerns. We make sure that they're up to date on all of their financials so that they've paid their taxes, they're paying for their inspection fees every year. And then once we confirm that, then they are able to pay for a short-term rental license. And we did kind of separate those into two buckets of owner-occupied short-term rentals, which is an owner that meets the definition of a homestead for the state. So someone who is living in their unit for at least over 50% of the year. So generally that's someone that maybe lives in the upstairs suite and has a short-term rental in their basement, or converted their garage into a short-term rental, or maybe they are a snowbird and they live here for 75% of the year and then they go to Florida for January and February and short-term rental their unit while they are down there. So that is the owner-occupied, and then the non-owner occupied is kind of what most people think about when they think of like an Airbnb or a VRBO, which is an individual housing unit that is used either exclusively for short-term rental activities, or the owner does not live there for more than 50% of the year. So the non-owner occupied are more likely to be investment properties, people that have bought buildings or own many buildings, or bought a building specifically to turn it into short-term rentals. And since that is more of kind of a blatant example of long-term rental housing being transitioned off of the long-term rental market into short-term rental exclusively, that was something that City Council chose that they wanted to target a little bit more intensely to try to dissuade people from continuing to do that conversion. So license fees for owner-occupied were set at $250 a year, and then non-owner occupied short-term rental license fees are $1,400. So it sounds quite high, but they did base that off of the average week for a short-term rental property in Winooski. Some are earning more, some are earning less. But the rollout of the program begun July 1st of this year, and we have actually had a lot of success. We've had a very high rate of compliance, which I am excited about because I know a lot of other municipalities have not been so fortunate. So we're really grateful for community members for being willing to accept and participate with the program. We've received about 65 applications, which represent about, about $75,000 in license fees. And that money goes to the Housing Trust Fund to reallocate into the programs that I spoke about just a couple minutes ago. And then a little bit of that also goes to our code enforcement team's budget to help fund the inspections that they do for all public buildings. So that's kind of the short-term rental programming. At this point, City Council does have the option come January 1st of next year, so 2025, to institute a cap on the total number of short-term rental licenses that are available for non-owner occupied, so investment property, Airbnbs. We wanted to wait a year so that we could collect data because we had no formal data that would help us show the number of owner-occupied versus non-owner occupied Airbnbs in the city. So there was no way for us to set a cap without knowing that number. And now that we have our own registry, we know that it's about a 75-25 split, with 75% of the Airbnbs being, or 75% of the
short-term rentals
being non-owner occupied kind of investment properties, and then 25% being owner occupied, kind of more mom and pop style short-term rentals. So once we have that data, we will send that over to council come next summer, and they will make the decision to cap that. And they can do that at a number that is equal to the number of licenses active, which would mean that everyone currently operating would be able to continue, but there would be no licenses available below or above that number, or they could set the number at a higher limit if they felt like more non-owner occupied short-term rentals were welcome in the city. That's not my decision, it's yours. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, so it's the short-term rental regulations provide a couple of important tools to us. One in regulating them, and there is interest in limiting the growth of them as it's impacting the long-term housing market. But also creating a mechanism to ensure that it's safe housing and it's not having negative impacts, and creating some funding to support the other goals in the Housing Trust Fund program and the work it takes to monitor all this, because it's a little bit more than looking after long-term housing from a code perspective.
Yes.
Speaking of housing quality and code, could you tell us about the minimum housing complaint? So what can people do if their landlord is not providing safe housing, and what should they expect in that area?
Yes. So every city, well, hopefully every city, at least I know we do, have minimum housing standards, which are a set of rules and regulations that help the city ensure that housing is safe and secure and healthy for the people who live there. And so we do have a specific online minimum housing complaint form. That is a form you can get one in person at City Hall. There's one on our website. And it will give you a list of reasons that you are filing the complaint. The reasons there's a whole lot of them. They range from things that are outside of a property to things that are in the interior of a property. So some of the exterior things might be like, there's a piece of the roof falling off, or there is grass that is significantly overgrown and it's covering the sidewalk and it could be a potential health hazard. There's an accumulation of trash in the yard, or there are abandoned cars that are not registered. Some of the internal things can be like broken windows or a broken doorway. There's no handrail. The heat has turned off. There are things like that, plus many, many more that can be reported. And the reports can be done by anyone, so it doesn't need to be someone who lives in the unit. It can be someone who is walking by the unit and notices something. It can be you visit your friend's unit or your neighbor's or your own. We do that so that everyone is supportive of protecting our housing and furthering community health. And then the form also is important to note that it is anonymous. So we will not know who it is sent from, which I think is important in ensuring that people who are brave enough to report violations don't fear retribution from whether that be their landlord or their neighbor or the property owner or anything like that. That's something that is really important for that. Since with housing being so scarce these days, we want to make sure that people feel safe in reporting minimum housing code violations.
Yeah, and then our code enforcement team will come and inspect and enforce if there is a violation.
Yes, that's correct.
So that's quite a few efforts we're doing locally to try to support the housing market or the housing landscape that we want, that meets community needs. Sean, do you want to talk about some more statewide efforts to support housing?
I would love to. First off, I actually want to commend the city of Winooski. A lot of the statewide efforts that we're engaged in right now have been begun in the city of Winooski. There's many things that you guys have excuse me, have started doing on the sort of leading edge, and the state sort of following up, namely, the fact that you have a code enforcement team is really great. We work a lot with a lot of municipalities that don't have that resource, and that can get really tough for, especially for renters. But lately, the Governor Scott's administration has been focused a lot on regulatory barriers. Act 250, we could do a whole show just on that. We could do several shows just on that. But a lot of the land use regulations have been kind of piecemeal, and to the point where it can be, I imagine that folks who might be watching, who know developers or know people who have tried to even just get a permit to put in an addition or connect to a sewer line or something like that, can be really expensive, and it can add to the cost of developing housing, which is part of the reason why we're in the situation that we're in. So a lot of work going into regulatory reform, trying to make government work better for people. But also there have been, especially post-COVID, a lot of really interesting developments in terms of different programs that the state is trying to run, recognizing that we have not built enough, just frankly, we've not built enough housing since the 80s, really the 1980s. So we're looking at 40 years of backlog, essentially. And we've done a great job, I think, as a state, maintaining our community centers and our village centers while keeping working lands. We haven't sprawled out. And so that has been, so some of those, I don't want to suggest that any of our land use regulations have been completely inept. They've been intentional and it's important, but 40 to 50 years on, it's time to reestablish where we're at and what we're trying to do. So regulatory reform is a huge part of the efforts that the state, if you will, is engaging in, and I say that with some tongue in cheek, because the state is all of us, and we're trying to move forward with intentional regulation and whatnot. But some of the really interesting things that are going on, I would encourage people to look for the Homes for All initiative, which is one that I don't think has gotten enough press, but the Department of Housing and Community Development, part of the Agency of Commerce, has been working on basically a toolkit for some of our small-scale developers, because the reality is we won't get, nor do we necessarily want, somebody from, let's say, California coming in and trying to do a California-sized development in Vermont. That just doesn't make sense. In most states, a 25-unit building is too small to even consider. Here, that'd be noticeable. And so the Homes for All program is actually trying to not necessarily incentivize, but educate and encourage small-scale development. So the sort of weekend warriors, all the way up to somebody who might be interested in, creating a duplex or a triplex. Infill development is what we like to call it, like sort of picking the little bits and pieces around already existing communities where you can kind of expand with, say, convert the garage into a dwelling unit, or use that extra half acre on the side of a lot to put in some housing there. So the Homes for All initiative is doing that, and we're actually the state's hopefully going to be expanding that program shortly. But you can see a delightful guidebook, and I'm happy to share information on how to get to that. But at the Agency of Commerce website, you can find it. Some other interesting initiatives are the Vermont Housing Incentive Program, which is not so different from the Winooski Housing Incentive Program, HIP. So VHIP is one that we've run throughout the state, that's providing grants to private landowners who have underutilized units. Anything from, again, that garage that might be converted into housing to, a unit that's maybe not code compliant. And can we put a little bit of public money and then into that to get it back onto the market? Because the more units, the better. The more units we have, the easier it is for everybody to find housing. The state's also looking a lot at, frankly, there's interest in short-term rental. Not necessarily a statewide regulation, but at least getting more information about how many we have. The city of Winooski has done a great job, I think, of identifying those. Being such a small area, it's a lot easier to do than when you're dealing with the whole state, but how we address those needs. We also work, and I could go on all night about the various different programs that we have, but the Vermont Housing Finance Agency has a number of really interesting programs right now, including some down payment assistance, particularly for first-generation home buyers. Okay. So young folks who might not be able to benefit from a parent who can lend them funds, maybe even second mortgage their own home to take some of that equity out. First-generation home buying can be supported by the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, and then on the landlord side as well. Vermont State Housing Authority, we've been working with them on a landlord relief program, which is intended to be not to simplify it too much, but essentially a bit of almost an insurance policy for landlords who sign up for the landlord relief program. If you're renting to somebody who might have, let's say, a checkered rental past or is exiting homelessness, might be a higher risk that a property owner would be a little bit hesitant about, can sign up for this program. Should damage occur or the tenancy not work out as it should, there are funds that might be able to be utilized to address those issues. And the whole idea is to try to reduce some of the friction between some of our most vulnerable and the people who rightfully are concerned about risking their own property and their own businesses to provide the service to the folks that we need most. So those are just a few. I'm happy to go on, but
no, that's really helpful. I mean, between the two, there are a lot of resources out there. There is a lot of work happening to try to address the sort of housing crisis that we're in. Obviously, things take time, and we don't have the solutions right now today to get everyone where we need to be. But a lot of support is out there, and more to come. For folks who aren't aware, there's also, if you are lower income, Winooski Housing Authority provides low-income housing here. The Champlain Housing Trust has both rental and ownership opportunities that are affordable in this region. And then the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity also provides a lot of supports. Jasmine, can you talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, sure. So also known as CVOEO, Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity. They have kind of a wide variety, I think over 20 anti-poverty programs, so they are kind of widespread. They have emergency shelter, kind of food shelves and nutrition programming. They help people sign up for SNAP. They do some weatherization for homes. They do some utility assistance. They have a tenant hotline that is heavily used and a great resource to our community. Amongst many other things.
And then we have all these programs on our website, winooskivt.gov. You can find all of these topics under Current Initiatives tab, Housing Resources and Initiatives. If you have a concern about your housing quality, under the How Do I tab, you can file a housing complaint. We also have multilingual videos on the page about housing resources, thanks to the Vermont Language Justice Project. Really excited to see how things advance. Back to the efforts on inclusionary zoning and replacement, because these are a little bit complex, trying to balance what will get us what we're looking for without inhibiting housing development. It takes a little bit of time, so Housing Commission and our Planning Commission, which is sort of in charge of our land use regulations, are working together on that, and we hope to have some progress in the coming year. Anything else to wrap us up that either of you would like to share?
I think we've covered it all.
I just thank you for this opportunity, and yeah, I appreciate the focus on this topic. It's obviously means a lot to a lot of people, and it means a lot to a lot of people's lives. So
thank you.
Yeah.
And it's great to see the state taking a lead as well in doing some of the work that we couldn't do locally. And we'll be happy to share out those state programs and resources you mentioned as well.
I'll follow up.
Thank you so much for joining us in the World of Winooski.